Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. This episode is brought to you by Overwolf. With over 1,500 games supported, 165,000 creators, and 38 million monthly active users, Overwolf is the guild for in-game creators. Whether you're a gamer, creator, or game studio, Overwolf is the ultimate destination for integrating UGC in games. For game studios, Overwolf offers CurseForge for studios, a white label solution that lets game makers and publishers easily integrate mods safely and seamlessly into their games, both existing and new, at zero cost. It's battle-tested by AAA studios and games, including Maxis with The Sims 4, Studio Wildcard with Arc, Take-Two Interactive, and others. For creators, Overwolf is the all-in-one platform that enables creators to build, distribute, and monetize in-game apps, mods, and game servers. In 2022, Overwolf paid over $160 million to in-game creators, proving that they truly value the talents and contributions of the gaming community. You can check out everything Overwolf has to offer at overwolf.com or check out the details in the show notes. And with that, let's jump into the episode.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and this is the interview and insight segment. If you're on LinkedIn, which you probably, if you're listening to this podcast, are, you've noticed a new section on the right-hand sidebar under LinkedIn News. It's called Puzzles. Some of you may have seen recent Connections play one of LinkedIn's 4 live games, Queens, Pinpoint, Cross Climb, or the newly released Tango. And it gives similar energy of the New York Times gaming puzzle section combined with a hint of the old era of Farmville on Facebook. LinkedIn has around 1 billion members in over 200 countries worldwide. For perspective, Facebook has over 3 billion members, and the New York Times has around 9 million online subscribers. There's a systemic trend in social media networks to create gaming-like engagements inside their platform, from Snapchat building up and then sunsetting Snap Games, and even something like Duolingo incorporating several tactics used by mobile gaming companies to increase retention and enhance engagement. Today, we're going to talk about LinkedIn's approach to building a gaming feature set inside the platform and discuss building games inside social media networks as a whole. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Lakshman Somasundaram to the Naavik studio today. Laksh is a director of product management at LinkedIn, where he is currently leading the Moonshots org. One can probably ascertain from that name that Moonshots is responsible for radical innovation on the platform. And one of those current initiatives is LinkedIn Games, of course. Laksh has been at LinkedIn for almost a full 10 years, and I'm really excited to have someone with such a long tenure at the company join us on air. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome. You seemingly are a huge LinkedIn fanboy.
I am. 10 years, almost. Yeah,
it's pretty rare to have somebody be at the company for so long nowadays. And so actually, that's a great intro into talking a little bit about yourself and telling the audience a little bit about you. I gave you a bit of an overview, but I'd love for you to walk me through, how you came to be at LinkedIn. You graduate from Yale and you sort of just long-term commit to this company. What drew you to LinkedIn, and describe your tenure at the company over the past decade.
So it's kind of a funny, unexpected story. So it'll all connect towards the end. But the way my LinkedIn journey started, it was a summer between sophomore and junior year of college. I was interning at First Round, a VC firm in San Francisco. And LinkedIn sent out an in-mail to all the interns in the city being like, there's a hackathon. Does anyone want to partake in the hackathon? So I go and participate in this intern hackathon at LinkedIn headquarters in Sunnyvale, the summer between my sophomore and junior year of college. Next thing I know, I end up meeting a bunch of people from LinkedIn through that. And I end up having a conversation with a couple people about what I wanted to do after college. And where that story goes is I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania called Kennett Square. Where if you're a mushroom fan, you've probably heard of it. It is the world's capital for mushrooms. So any types of mushrooms that people consume, they're probably grown in Kennett Square. Over 50% of mushrooms consumed in the US are grown in the small town in Pennsylvania. And what that means is most of the population where I grew up is migrant farm workers. And a lot of what I was always interested in is upward economic mobility for farm workers. And I was having this conversation with people from LinkedIn. Like LinkedIn, the mission is to connect the world's professionals to create economic opportunity. And it feels like there's so much that the platform could do to help populations like migrant farm workers create economic mobility. And what that resulted in was me starting to work for LinkedIn from school, working on projects related to this in terms of frontline workers, first line workers, to help create economic ability, help people find community college training programs to upskill, all that sort of stuff. And that's when I became like really attached to the mission of the company. And that's kind of the reason I've still been here 10 years later, where everything I worked on since I started 10 years ago to today connects back to the idea of like creating economic opportunity for people. And I think it's awesome to be somewhere where you get to work at the cutting edge of tech and at the same time doing good and doing well at the same time.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, first, I'm also from Pennsylvania, and so you just
Nice.
educated me as a fellow Pennsylvanian on something that I did not know about Pennsylvania's aptitude for mushroom agriculture. And second, I love that message. And I wish we could talk about that more because I actually know that it's one of the big, this is very, very like off topic, but tangentially related to LinkedIn. But, LinkedIn has definitely had the presence of being a strong professional white collar network. And there's actually a lot of innovation, I think, in the startup space for people that are trying to build the LinkedIn for miners or for, like you said, the people that were working on this mushroom farm. So I wish I could talk about that the whole time, but unfortunately, we're talking about games. But very cool story. So let's kind of get to that. I read Daniel Roth's and your piece on LinkedIn and why they should pursue games and what's the game strategy. But I would love for you to tell the audience who may not have read those blogs, why build games at LinkedIn?
Yeah, totally. So kind of what I mentioned earlier, everything we think about at LinkedIn goes back to the mission to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. And one thing that we've always thought a lot about is the fact that, you might come to LinkedIn and you'll connect with people who you know in your professional network, right? But the most important thing is not just connecting with people, but actually staying in touch, staying in contact with them. Because when people stay in touch, that's what creates real conversations. That's what creates introductions, referrals, all the things that result in economic opportunity in the world happens from people being connected, those connections staying in touch. So one thing we think about constantly as a company is how do we actually help people stay in touch with their professional network and the people who they know? And one of the things we realize is when you look at ignore technology, ignore LinkedIn, ignore the app for a second. When you think about the real world and when you think about how people stay in touch in the real world in a professional context and how people form bonds, what we've noticed, and hopefully you've felt too, is that a lot of it is by having fun together, where work and fun are not disconnected topics at all. Or oftentimes you actually meet people at that happy hour. You end up, you're on the little pickleball team at work and you end up meeting people through that. And that's how you form great connections. And that's the reality of the real world, where by having fun together, we actually deepen our professional connections. And historically, there hadn't yet been a way on LinkedIn to really have fun together in a way that deepened these professional bonds. And that's why we got into this space, where it didn't start with like, hey, we want to be a gaming company. We don't want to be a gaming company. We are a professional opportunity networking connection company, and that's what our mission has always been about, and that's what it will always be about. Games is just another avenue for us to pursue that same mission, where by enabling people to have fun together, by enabling them to talk about those games together, that actually creates a really lightweight way. When I share my Queen score with you and you share your Queen score with me and we start talking about that, that creates a really nice inroads into having a deeper conversation about something else.
Yeah, I totally see that. It's about also just having shared experiences of, whether or not it was fun or type 2 fun. It's something for you to mutually talk about. And so I think that makes sense from maybe the LinkedIn approach as to why LinkedIn pushed this. But I guess another question is, were people asking for this at LinkedIn? Your the users, the daily active users of LinkedIn, and why this versus any other LinkedIn feature that's probably in the pipeline, of which there's probably a plethora?
Look, so one thing that we've heard consistently from our members and from professionals is that one of the most common water cooler topics that people talk about is daily games that they play. And these have existed forever, right? Crosswords are over 100 years old now. People playing crosswords, bringing them into work, people playing Sudoku, people playing Wordle, all of these are existing trends. And people do these when they come into the workplace and, you get off the bus, you get off your bike, you come in, you talk about today's Wordle, you talk about today's crossword, you talk about the Sudoku that you just played. And it becomes this really easy conversational topic. So the fact that so many of our members are doing that already every single day. And when we think about the types of games that we're focused on, right, we are focused on a very specific niche category of games that we call thinking-oriented games. Like they are meant to exercise your mind. If Queens is hard one day, it is meant to be hard that day because it is meant to exercise your mind.
Oh, it's hard.
So it felt like this kind of perfect kind of coming together of something that people already do in the context of conversations at work and something that actually exercises your mind. Because anything that we do, we want to ensure it fits within the ethos of LinkedIn, fits within this idea of like, this actually feels like a really productive way for me to take a break, for me to do something on the way into work that only takes a minute, a couple minutes. So that's how it really came about, was this idea that professionals are already playing games in the morning often that are thinking-oriented games. You can imagine when you bring the magic of LinkedIn into that, which we'll talk a lot more about, that it becomes even more powerful.
I see. Okay. And so then you've been mentioning a lot about like these thinking games, these learning games. And I kind of want to ask a question because I think that this is something that has happened to the New York Times, who has also done and attempted to install this really big, again, thinking game strategy. Think Wordle and Connections. These are all like, they're not like FPSs, but I want to ask maybe like a potentially contentious question. Note this is not my personal view because I've made games literally my entire professional vocation. But I guess maybe someone could say, isn't LinkedIn a professional networking site and isn't it potentially detractive for it to become, quote, a gaming site? Now, I ask this question mostly because of the following. New York Times' engagement patterns of their users is actually shifting towards games significantly, and it might be a potential augury for the future. So a lot of New York Times readers are spending more time playing the New York Times games than they are actually reading the news. And I kind of wonder if this is something that LinkedIn maybe considered when it comes to LinkedIn's mission and values as a professional networking site, causing the parallel of saying that the New York Times is meant to deliver news and opinion on the state of our globe, and then people are playing the crossword. So I don't know. Any thoughts as regards to that?
Okay, so a couple of thoughts. One, we're super intentional about the fact that everything that we do connects back to the mission. It's about creating economic opportunity. When people come to LinkedIn, it's to connect with folks. So the reason we have games is to help people connect with people, right? It's like one of many avenues through which you can connect with other individuals on LinkedIn. We're not a gaming site, right? We are a professional networking opportunity site. It's the reason when you go to LinkedIn, the games are there, right? But it's not like games is the entire product or the entire site. And we're super intentional that that's not the plan. The plan is for our product to always be one where you go to create opportunity for yourself and for others. And games is one of many vectors on the site that enables people to do that.
Got it.
And for the folks, when it comes up the topic of we're bringing games into something that's professional, that's where the worldview that we're taking is that the world is evolving to one where fun and work really, really come together really well. And especially with Gen Z entering the workforce, this cannot be more common today in terms of fun and work going hand in hand. And LinkedIn should always, when I think about what LinkedIn should feel like, it should feel like the world's best workplaces. If you log into LinkedIn and it feels like the world's best workplace, we've done our jobs. And the world's best workplaces have fun as a part of them. So we need to have fun as a part of it.
Well, I can totally get behind that mission. Again, wanted to say that I am definitely a huge believer of having work be fun. And, I make games for a living. So very exciting. Okay. So in terms of, you said you're not going to be a gaming platform. And we're going to talk a lot more about LinkedIn's games, the specific games you have, who's playing what, et cetera, and some of the more like product management stuff and KPI things around those games in the future. But in general, what is the overall business objective for having this? How do games tie into the P&L at a high level? Right. You talked about it being connections. So that's my experience as a user. But for LinkedIn as a business, I guess my head goes towards this is hours on platform, but it's not currently necessarily tied right now to monetization. So, and we'll talk more about this later as well. But how do you guys see LinkedIn games folding into the overall business for LinkedIn?
So when you think about LinkedIn's business, whether it's talent solutions, which is our recruiting business, marketing solutions, which is advertising on the site, sales solutions, premium, and so on, the tide that lifts all boats is when people are connected to each other and they have conversations. So let's take the talent solutions example, for example. So when people get jobs on LinkedIn, what makes unique about getting a job on LinkedIn or through LinkedIn is the fact that you can get one through a referral, right? By looking at someone's profile, by reaching out to them so they connect you with someone who they know, a mutual connection. You end up talking with that person that ends up helping you get a job in a really effective, meaningful way. So the way that we think about initiatives like our games is that it should be a part of the tide that lifts all boats. It on its own is not a monetization initiative for the company, right? What it does is it creates conversation, it creates community, it creates connections, it deepens and reignites the connections that already exist. When that happens, all the boats start to lift, right? We see people actually getting jobs. We see people connecting with each other, starting conversations that they otherwise wouldn't have started. So that's how we think about it. Ultimately, the most important thing for us, always talk about members first. When people come to the platform, we need to deliver on our mission for members. Whatever we do to deliver on that mission for members, to help them connect with each other, to help them have conversations, that drives all the business lines. And that's the reason, for example, when you go to the games today, you don't see ads on the games, right? Because the way that we think about the reason that we have this product, going back to members first, going back to connection, conversation, it's to drive that. It's to drive the connection and conversation. And we know that when we do that really, really well, and we can actually reignite, spark relationships and conversations, everything else starts to flow.
Okay, got it. Yeah, it's definitely like a bolstering of the whole LinkedIn engagement on the platform. And we'll definitely talk a lot more later about who is doing that and how is that actually going for you guys so far. But I'm going to take a little bit of like a side pivot to talk a little bit about some strategy stuff.
Sure.
In general, social media platforms as a marketplace for games, and kind of like the LinkedIn high level strategy, because I'm sure that you guys are looking across to other social media platforms who have done this in the past and seeing what you like and seeing maybe what you don't like. And so before we jump into more detail about LinkedIn games, I selected about 3 to 4 social media networking sites that have taken tactics towards building games. And of course, this is not exhaustive, but I'm kind of going to run through a couple of these, and then we'll have a little jam session about it. So the first is Facebook. Facebook Games had its major heyday with Farmville, Nightclub City, Mafia Wars, Pet Society, Backyard Monsters, Tetris during the core of the 2010s. And none of these games were actually made by Facebook themselves, but they were partnered games on Flash for web browser on Facebook Canvas. Farmville particularly is a game that we probably all know really, really well. And Zynga's Mark Pincus wrote that the real innovation in Farmville was making games accessible to, quote, busy adults, giving them a place to invest and express themselves. Farmville is also the cornerstone of Zynga's big data strategy. However, as it's widely known, Facebook discontinued its game. The official reason is that Adobe shut down Flash Player, which made it difficult to support web browser games. But the shift also largely coincided with the rise of mobile platforms, which led Facebook to prioritize mobile app installs over web gaming. But despite this, one could probably consider that Facebook's foray into gaming was a significant success story for the platform. So that's the first one, Facebook. The second one is Snapchat. Which is maybe the opposite side to the Facebook success story, is Snapchat games. In 2023, Snapchat officially pulled the plug after years of lower than expected traction and monetization as the platform struggled to put positive margins and growth into its business. At the same time, Snapchat games weren't played by nobody. They were regularly engaged with, actually, but I even myself remember playing some of the basketball games with friends. But they were built internally, though there were some partnerships with studios like King. But arguably, this is probably a failure story for games on a social media platform. And then finally, Telegram. Shout out to my colleague, Nico Vori. He's another host with us, who hosted a conversation about Telegram Games, which is the fastest growing distribution platform for games currently. He hosted the CEO of Mighty Bear, who built a hit game on Telegram that hit 2 million users in 5 weeks. They have over 1 billion users and 200 million games today. These games also leverage crypto as payment, as Telegram's obviously known for being built natively for the crypto community. So I say these couple of examples, Facebook, Snapchat, and Telegram, because they kind of set the scene for some of the strategies that other social media platforms have done or taken in the past or are currently taking. What do you think about these three? And how does LinkedIn strategy, or what lessons do you take from prior platform successes or failures?
Thanks for sharing. I think so. First thing to acknowledge is like we are definitely standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to this space, right? We are not, I've said it multiple times, we're not a gaming company. And there's a lot of companies that have really trailblazed over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whether it's in mobile games, PC games, thinking-oriented games, and we're learning from all that, and we get to benefit from learning from all that. So I think it's the first thing, even though some of the things that you shared, maybe it didn't work out for those companies necessarily, but I think there's a lot of meaningful learnings from those that help all of us who are working in the game space today. So it's the first thing I'll share. In terms of when I think about our approach and what makes it unique, the first thing I would say is we do not see ourselves as a platform where we bring a bunch of games onto the platform for people to play those games. So this isn't like third-party publishers come in. It is a frequent ask that we get for third-party publishers who have games to want to have their games on LinkedIn. Our goal is not to have a suite of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, how many ever games, right? It's not a metric we track. It's not a metric we care about. We're not looking to have a large number of games. We're not looking to have every popular game on LinkedIn. In fact, our strategy is very much focused on having games that are 100% exclusive to us and that you can only play on LinkedIn. And the reason we've gone down that path is going back to the thing that we care most about is the games need to be ones that actually drive community and drive conversation and are very thinking oriented. And that's like a very niche combination, right? You want to have games that actually get people talking so that you start a conversation with someone you otherwise might not have started a conversation with. And when you play, you want to feel like, whoa, like I'm actually exercising my mind and that's helping me rejigger a thought or it's helping me prepare for a certain meeting. Like it's actually really productive. And the class of games that fall into the category that meets both those is actually quite small. So that's the reason we're very focused on ensuring any game we deliver to our members, it's not just us putting like our stamp of approval on it. Like we are the ones making it. And part of the path that we went down is we went and hired some of the world's best talent to make these games. So Paolo Pasco, who is the national crossword champion this year, shout out to him. He is our games. I don't know if you just heard a little clock go off. That was my computer. Sorry about that. But Paolo Pasco, who is our games editor internally at LinkedIn, is the national crossword champion. So he is one of the world's foremost people when it comes to the space of creating word games. Thomas Snyder, who's the 3-time world Sudoku champion, is the person who is making Queens and Tango every single day.
Oh, no wonder it's so hard.
You know, it's a little funny because
so much better about not being able to ever do Queens now.
It's funny because I think, like I said, these are some of the most brilliant minds in the world. So something that takes Thomas 2 minutes, I will be sitting there for like 20 minutes still trying to figure out. Shout out to Thomas, though, who has like also the ability to really calibrate for what a beginner puzzle should be. And that's something I'm sure we'll talk about a lot more. But going back to like where our strategy is different, we're really focused on the specific type of game that we want to have. As a result, we develop all of our games in-house and we brought in some of the world's best talent to do that. So that's like the first differentiator that I call out is that we are not a games platform. We are not looking to become a games platform, just open and honest. We are a professional networking and economic opportunity company, and we need games that really tie back to that mission. So we're very focused on building games in-house.
Okay. And so, all right, so that's a big difference, right? So a lot of these examples, Telegram and Facebook, they very much did not build their own games, like house third-party games on them. Snapchat did build their own, and to some extent, to middling-ish to not true success. But are there anything that these other platforms have done that you really like? Or is there somebody else that you're watching that you're like, let's do and mimic exactly that small piece? Even if we're not meant to be a games platform, this specific thing that they've done with their titles is fantastic and we want to emulate that.
Absolutely. So let's go back to the Facebook example that you had shared earlier. I think one thing that Facebook really proved through their game strategy is the ability for communities to come together via games. Like that felt like the first true social media connection driven, like I'm taking an action in a game. I want you to become a part of it and actually creating that community. That's inspired a lot of how we think about our games, right? And we do it in a different way. It's not like I want a turnip, you have a turnip, let's talk about trading turnips or something like that, right? It's very different. But that ethos of like games are powerful ways to drive connection and community absolutely is there. So one thing that is unique in the way that we've executed on this is the school and company leaderboards, right? So after you play, Queens or Tango today, you'll actually see, let's say you went to University of Michigan, you'll see how Michigan alums are doing versus Ohio State alums. And that's like a unique way for us to drive conversation and community that no other platform can do, because only LinkedIn has that data, that information that you provided on your profile on where you went to school. Same thing with your company. How's your company doing versus other companies in the industry? So those are, concepts that I think when you go to the seeds of it, probably root back to Facebook's gaming strategy of focus on community, focus on connection. But then when you take that seed and you look at what's unique about LinkedIn that only we can do, you realize whoa, you could actually have company leaderboards, based off games. So it's not just like the company softball league leaderboard that you have, but something that, you could do asynchronous online and so on. So there's a ton that I'd say we're constantly learning from and borrowing. And I think that's one of the things that I love about the space is that everyone is learning and borrowing from each other. And that makes it awesome.
Yeah. And I think that definitely is a huge thing that was a true joy on Facebook, was being able to connect and go through all those channels and see who is playing from high school that you haven't talked to in 7 years, and then you give them a turn up, and then all of a sudden you're friends again.
Exactly. And that's literally, so it's funny you mentioned that. When we first launched games, one of the things I was most surprised by was the number of people who I went to high school with, who were reaching out to me, because I'm connected on LinkedIn with a bunch of people I went to high school with. I went to high school in Delaware, so obviously no longer in Delaware. And haven't necessarily kept in closest touch with a lot of people I went to high school with, but it was a cool way of whoa, and now we share game scores with each other. It's been a fun way to reconnect.
Got it. And then I guess to the side of, that connection and that virality, I think one of the difficulties or one of the pushbacks that Facebook had was, to some extent, and maybe this is avoidable because you're not posting third-party content, but some of the third-party content vendors were kind of accusatory or of abusing some of the water cooler channels. So too many friend requests, too many pokes, almost a dilution of what is intrinsically the information that I was trying to get at. So I could imagine that so many of my friends are playing Queens that the only thing I have in my feed is Queens or notifications versus, that news article or that venture capital raise that I really wanted to read about that LinkedIn used to notify me of. How are you designing, I guess, the notification algorithm, if that's even the right word, to ensure that stuff doesn't kind of swallow, I guess, the rest of the platform?
Yeah, it's a great call out. It's something we're super intentional about. So when it comes to and this goes back to the idea of we're not a gaming platform. We're an economic opportunity platform, and there's so many avenues on LinkedIn to get economic opportunity. Games is one of those and should not overshadow any one of the others. The way that we think about our notification strategy, since you mentioned notification specifically, is if you are playing Queens and you have a streak and you want to keep that streak up, you should get a notification, right? Because it's a reminder for you that you want to play Queens and you've been playing Queens for the last 150 days. Don't miss today's Queens. If you are not playing Queens, if no one in your network is playing Queens, right, there is no reason we should be inundating your notification channel with the notifications about Queens. So one of the most frequent pieces of feedback that we hear, the flip side of this is, I had no clue that LinkedIn has games. It's one of the things that we hear all the time of LinkedIn has games. What? What games does LinkedIn have? And then, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the most common way that people hear about our games is through a conversation. So it's someone shares their Queen score on LinkedIn, on iMessage, anywhere, and then their friend or their colleague sees it, then clicks in and hears about it. That's intentional from a strategic perspective. I love the fact that most people who hear about our games hear about them from someone they care about, right? Because when you hear about a product, when you hear about a feature from someone you care about, someone you trust, that makes it all the more likely that you go into it with the mindset of I'm really curious. I want to see what this is about. If LinkedIn, as a platform, right, is really pushing games as have you seen our games? Have you seen our games? We failed in the thing that we built games for, which is to drive conversation and connection. So, it's a long way to answer your question, but we're not really focused on kind of on-platform notifications. We're focused on making it fun and exciting to share the game that you just played, right? The notification shouldn't be coming from LinkedIn. It should be coming from your friend. And when it comes from your friend, it should be thoughtful, right? So the way that I hope you've seen some of the new things that we've ramped over the last couple of weeks, but for listeners who haven't seen these, after you play a game, for example, you can see things like how you did versus your network. We'll tell you're in the top 10% of your network, how you did versus your company. My favorite one, kind of a play on Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? We have Are You Smarter Than a CEO? You can actually see how your score was compared to the average score of a CEO who played today. All these things, right? When you send that message to your connection, it comes with that context, and it comes with like a sneak preview of the game. So for example, with Queens, we'll actually show the first 3 colors that you placed. For Tango, we'll show the first placements that you made on the board. All that sparks genuine conversation. There is no like, hi, I need like 5 coins to do, like, there's no coins. There's none of that. Like in the approach that we're taking, it's purely, I played, I want to talk about the strategy. I want to see how you did. Let's talk about it together. There's no like ask of like, I need you to do something so that I can do something. And like that, those are all things that we're not focused on. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Makes sense. And yeah, I guess I don't know how I discovered it. I think I just saw it on the sidebar once or twice, but I've definitely, even in saying, hey, I'm having this conversation later today, people are like, oh, LinkedIn has games. So I guess you're accomplishing your mission there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about those specific games. We've talked a lot about the strategy. We've talked a lot about why, and some of the guardrails that you guys are going to have, given that you're anchoring yourself as a professional networking site versus a games platform or a games company. So you decided you wanted to do this. How many people? You told me a little bit about who you hired, which is why the Queens thing is so hard, because you hired the Sudoku champion guy to make those, and that's why I can't finish it. But how many people?
If we have time at the end, we can do like quick tangent. Sorry to interrupt. Queens is one of those games where the first couple of times you play, it's definitely really tough. What's honestly beautiful about it from like a game perspective is that once you learn each logical deduction, it becomes significantly easier. So one of the fun journeys that people go through, and we can talk about this when we come to how we design the game boards and how we line them up each day and the progressive difficulty over the week. We're honestly trying to teach members all the logical deductions, because when you start seeing them, you'll go from like solving it in like 5 minutes to 2 minutes to 1 minute, and then it becomes like a time-based competition. But anyway, sorry, we can get to that later.
No, that makes sense. So that actually reminded me of something that I wanted to echo back was your notification, going back to your notification strategy right briefly before we move on. It's actually very similar to the New York Times, right? They're not in your face about, hey, play this game, here's an ad. But it's very much reliant on the virality of being able to share it over iMessage in your friend group chat, or your mom is like, I did the Wordle, and you feel like you need to participate. And so I think it sounds like you have a similar strategy, but it's less, maybe friends, like familial friends, or, in my other social network, but rather people in my professional connection, my professional world.
Totally. And I think the other key differentiator call is like LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, we have the built-in messaging platform.
Yes.
So you can easily see after just you play all the people from your connection, all the people from your school, and it's much easier to start those conversations. Yeah, totally.
Okay. So the Sudoku guy is making Queens. Apparently I haven't figured out any logical deductions because it's still very difficult for me. But how else are you staffing the opportunity? So like right now there are 4 games. I mentioned them at the beginning: Queens, Cross Climb, Tango, and there's one more.
Pinpoint.
And Pinpoint, right? How big is each team? And how did you staff against, or are there multiple people working on each game?
Okay, it's funny. It's interesting you phrased it that way. So we don't have like a Queens team, a Pinpoint team, a Tango team, and a Cross Climb.
I'm very video game world. You got a Fallout team.
It totally makes sense.
You've got a World of Warcraft team, an Overwatch team.
But what they have a lot of appreciation and admiration for is people who work on these franchises that are like giant franchise teams where you work on a release for 3 years, 4 years, and it's like a massive moment. Like, I think that's awesome. It is very different from our approach. Tango is a game that we came up with maybe 3 months before launch. And then we built it in about 10 weeks, let's say. It's end to end from like the beginning prototyping to the testing to all the iteration that we did, and then we launched it. And the same folks who are working on Tango are the same folks who are building Are You Smarter Than a CEO? So the way that I think about the team is there's 2 kind of categories of things to think about. One is the core game itself. The second is everything around the game that creates conversation and community. It's not like we have a team that's focused on the games and a team that's focused on, the conversation in the community. It ebbs and flows, right? When we're about to release a new game, a lot more of the team is focused on really ensuring we're excellent at launching that game. Once it's launched, everyone's focused on the thing we care most about, which is driving conversation and community. The reason that we, launch new games, for example, and you probably noticed we launched 1 new game since we launched the initial 3. We're not like rolling out games every single week. part of the reason for that is the existing games are working really nicely when it comes to driving conversation and community. So most of the team is focused on doing more and more of that versus building more and more games.
Okay, I see. All right. So then there's like one games unit, and that unit is basically split between creating features and things that help accelerate connections. So maybe integrated quick send to chat and things like that, and then the actual structure of the gameplay and the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics itself. And so talk me through a high level of the games you've made so far. We've talked about Queens, but nobody. For those in the audience that have not played Queens, what's Queens? What's Pinpoint? What's Cross Climb? What's Tango? Gameplay wise.
Yeah, let's do it. So start with Queens since we've been talking about it, and then we can move to Tango, which is our other logic game, and then we'll move to our 2-word games, Pinpoint and Cross Climb. So the best way to describe Queens is something that takes a lot of inspiration from both Sudoku and Minesweeper. So for those listening on podcasts, imagine those two games kind of coming together nicely, and a little bit of chess too. So the way Queens works is it's a grid, and let's say the grid size can vary day to day, but call it like a 9x9 grid. If you have a 9x9 Queens grid, your objective is to place a queen in every single row and every single column, but only one in every single row and every single column. And inside the grid, there's a bunch of colored regions. You can only have one queen inside each color region. So one per row, one per column, one per color region, and only one per row, only one per column, and only one per color region. So it's a game of like you're looking at the board and you're trying to figure out oftentimes like where's the first queen going to go? And you start having to use lots of logical deductions to realize it can't go here, it can't go here. So this is a game where a lot of the moves that you make are actually elimination moves rather than actually placing a queen. So you can go and place X's to figure out where a queen might not be, and then you eventually figure out there's going to be a queen here, and you kind of take it on from there. It's always interesting, funny talking about these games without being able to see them because the games are very visual. So highly recommend folks to go check out the game, and you'll see what I'm talking about when you get there. But that's Queens. It was our first Logic game, and it became very, very popular very quickly because I think there was something really novel about it. In terms of for people who had played Minesweeper, 10, 20 years ago, it brought back a lot of those feelings that you had when you were playing Minesweeper. For people who played Sudoku, it had a familiar feeling with Sudoku, but felt like novel and different. One of the things we were super intentional about is that there's no numbers in the game. And I'll speak from my own personal experience. I had not played Sudoku for a long time, and I'm someone who has I want to go take something saying I have like a fear of math, but I'm not like a math person. And oftentimes when people think about logic games, they think about numbers. And then for people who are not math oriented, you look at a grid with the numbers and you're like, I can't do this. So we were really intentional about Queens. There's only one icon in there and it's a crown. Right. So it feels much more welcoming. It's also the reason it's a colored grid. Oftentimes when people play Logic games, they're black and white. We brought colors into it, brought the crowns into it. So made it a lot more accessible, a lot more joyful, yet kept a lot of the potential for complexity, which is the reason it can feel tough. And Queens, like all of our other games, it starts out easy on Mondays and it gets more and more difficult all the way when you get to Sunday. And we'll notice kind of in our own data, the amount of time that people spend, right? Maybe it takes you a minute on Mondays, it takes you 5 minutes on Sundays. So that's Queens. Then we can move to Tango. So Tango is the newest game that we released. I think it was October 8th, so three to 4 weeks at this point. And I'll tell you why we released Tango. So Queens was taking off and still continues to take off. And the most frequent requests we've gotten is I want to play Queens more than once a day. And we're very intentional about having the games be once a day. Going back to we're not looking to become a gaming platform. So the way that we think about our strategy, the way that we focus on everything is if you're spending like 20 minutes on LinkedIn playing games, we failed. Right? That's not our goal. If you spent 2 minutes playing a game and then starting conversation, boom, that's success, right? So for that reason, like we're not looking to have like some unlimited, like play every Queens today sort of thing. But we understood people had an itch for more where I think there's people who really like word games, which we'll talk a lot about in a little bit. People really like logic games. For those who like logic games, we only had one. Whereas for people like word games, we had two. So we wanted to bring something new. And the second thing with Tango is Queens, rightfully so, is a difficult game to pick up at first. And we wanted something that would be a little bit like even more accessible for people who had never played a logic game before, almost to the extent of being an on-ramp onto Queens. And that's where Tango came from. So Tango, kind of going down the list, after Queens, we have Tango, which is our newest logic game. The way Tango works is, think of it as, again, a grid. And inside this grid, there are two emojis, typically a sun and moon. We'll talk a little bit about special emoji days, which we just had one for Halloween yesterday, one for Diwali today. But typically, there's suns and moons. And your objective in the grid is to fill every single cell with a sun or a moon. And you need to have 3 suns and 3 moons in every single row and column. And you can never have more than 2 suns next to each other or 2 moons next to each other. So again, like logical thinking that you have to go through to realize, like, okay, if there's a sun here, could there be a moon here? If there's 2 suns here, I know there has to be moons on either side. And you start going through all those thought processes to complete the grid and fill it out with all suns and moons. So that's Tango, which is the second logic game, which is quickly becoming quite popular. And then we got Pinpoint and Cross Climb. So these are the ones that, Tango and Queens, Thomas Snyder, our world Sudoku champion, is creating those grids every single day. Pinpoint and Cross Climb is Paolo, the national crossword champion, who's making those every single day. And the way Pinpoint works is think of it as a game where there are 5 words that all belong to one category. Your objective is to figure out what category they all have in common. But the twist, compared to like any other category game you've likely played before, is that we only reveal one word at a time. So the first word might be like dog, right? And then you have to guess what the category is. Then there could be a second word. Then there could be a third word and a fourth word. And your objective is to like guess the category as quickly as possible in as few clue reveals as possible. So it's really one where like people feel proud when they get it like on the first try, which we call a hole in the one when you get that. So if you ever get in one, you'll see a nice like hole in the one celebration screen after you get it. But that's Pinpoint. The mechanics are very simple. It's a word category game, but we put a twist on it to make it different from any other word category game that people have played. And that's something you'll notice is a common thread across all of our games, where we will never just take a game that exists, right, and use exactly that. We learn from all the mechanics of games that people love and then bring our unique kind of LinkedIn twist to it. So that's Pinpoint. And speaking of that, Cross Climb. So Cross Climb, what it is 2 games that people really love, crosswords and word ladders. We brought them together in a unique way. So the way that it works is it's trivia, right, in the way that crosswords trivia, where there's a bunch of clues. All the clues have the same number of letters. So usually 4 to 5 letters. Let's say 5 letters. You're filling out, imagine like the middle rungs of a ladder. And the key thing is that every word will be 1 letter off from another word. But the rungs in the ladder are all jumbled together. So it's not yet in correct order. So what you're doing is you're going through like the way you'd go through almost a mini crossword, but you're also using this other part of your brain to think like, what order should this word go in versus another word? And you rearrange those words. Once you do that, the most fun part of Cross Climb, at least for me, is you unlock the top and bottom rungs of the ladder, which is a compound clue that Paolo creates. So then it's one clue that you have to use to get both the top word and the bottom word. So those are the 4 games. They're all pretty different, right? And that's pretty intentional on our end of, we want to have a game for everyone, right? The goal is not to have like 4 games where everyone is playing 4 games. Going back to like, we're not looking to be a gaming platform. The goal is to have at least one game that is really meaningful for everyone in terms of like anyone who comes to LinkedIn, checks out a game, you should find one that speaks to you in terms of it exercises your mind. It's something you want to start a text message thread about. Like if that happens, then it's success.
Got it. Yeah, and they definitely all sound really different. And they're definitely, like you said, a mixture of logic, word puzzles, etc. Like as you described, learning games. I also just want to throw out there, I'm not sure if you guys are interested in making $50 million more per year, but if you make a $4.99 unlimited Queen subscription, or add it into the premium tier, and you have a 1% conversion on your 1 billion users, it's already 50 million. So I think that if you have a bunch of users, it's interesting that, actually one of my questions was, right now you can only play these games 1 time a day. Yeah. Do you ever foresee changing that? And it sounds like you have pretty strong conviction to no, because you said that it's a failure case if people are spending over 20 minutes playing LinkedIn games. And so I think that actually kind of brings me back to the first question of like, yeah, it is your mission. Your mission is that you want this to be a professional networking site. You don't want gaming engagement to swallow the other types of engagement on the platform. And so you're going to put kind of guardrails. The 1 time a day limit is definitely part of that.
Absolutely. Like that, like our current focus is entirely on making sure there's one game for each person that's incredible at strengthening your mind and driving conversation.
Got it.
Of course, there's like a booming premium business that we've got going. If a lot of premium members were to come to us and say, I'm interested in some new feature in games, like, we'll always consider things that members ask for, but our focus, our mission, right, it all ties back to driving community, driving conversation. That goes back to having one game that each member should love every day.
I see. And so we talked a little bit about how long you want these games to take as they get harder and escalating throughout the week. On day 1, it takes about a minute. On day 5 or day 7, it takes about 5 minutes. And one of the things I do notice about your games is that they are individual, right? They're about, I do this on my own. Yep. And then I share my score with everybody else. And you talked about designing and thinking about games that bring connection. And you talked a little bit about what games you will not make on this platform. So you will not incorporate other studios' games like Facebook and Zynga did. And you will not, for example, try to have session lengths that are above 5 minutes or so. But, would you ever consider, in this regard, it is a PvP nature, right? Because you are competing with everybody, but individually. What about other kind of co-op games where people are collaborating at the same time? How are you thinking about future games for the platform?
Yeah, I'd say, never say never. At the same time, like, one of the things we're super cautious of and aware of is professionals are really busy. LinkedIn should never feel like something that's sucking time out of your day. It should feel like something that's making you more productive and more successful at work. So to the extent that there is an extension of our gaming strategy that stays true to that does become, more involved than what we got now, open to it. Right now where we're at is like focusing on what we've got, which is working really well for us and something we're really excited about. So that's where my mind's at. Yeah.
I see. And so you've made these games. You said you have like kind of one team. I don't remember if you told me how big it is, but
it's kind of your standard 2-pizza team. Yeah.
Okay, got it. So maybe like 30 people, 30-ish?
Not even.
Not even? Okay, 20 people. What has actually been challenging? Like, you guys aren't, like you said, you are not a gaming company.
Yeah.
So what have you struggled with? What has, in terms of development, for example, one time I have playing Queens and it was buggy. So like what has been the challenge for you guys at making these 4 games that, you can share?
Yeah. So I'd say definitely for the first month, like massive learning curve, right? And I hope the buggy Queens has not been happening anytime recently. If so, always let me know if you experience bugs. But say first month after launching, right, like massive learning curve. At the same time, look, one of the benefits of having people like Paolo, people like Thomas on the team contributing to the team is that they bring years of world-class experience to the stuff. So while we as a company, as a product are new to this stuff, the people working on it are not necessarily entirely new to it. And that really like speeds up the learning curve. So after we launch, right, there's a lot of things that we start to notice. Like one of the core metrics that we track to understand if people are understanding the games is win rate, first time win rate. So of the people who play on day 1, how many of them are actually winning the game? And the percent that like I think most about that we want to hit is 60%. And the reason we want to hit 60% first time win rate is it is that perfect balance of, that the game is not so easy that it's boring and it's not so hard that people don't get it. So we really optimize for going for that like 60 to 70% range. And initially there was a learning curve to get to that. But one of the awesome things about building, at a company like LinkedIn and product like LinkedIn is that we have great analytics, great tracking to very quickly understand like, whoa, that was way too hard at Queens or like way too easy a pinpoint. And then we calibrate off of that. And now, we're at a point where we have over 150 days of data points. And that makes it much more easy when you have more experience, like real data points to know how to calibrate the difficulty of the games. But that's when we started, right? It's a little bit of Wild West for us where we went for it with our intuition. It, within a week or 2, we calibrated well, but initially it was just completely new to us. And that's been, I think, like a really powerful learning, just like optimizing for that 60% and understanding that, the folks who work on the games are always going to be more experienced and faster at playing the games than the average member on LinkedIn. That's always something for us to be mindful of and aware of. And especially to your point, when we have world-class people like Paolo and Thomas making the games, right? What makes a game fun for someone who is at that level is different from what makes a game fun for someone who's never played one of these games before. And I think we've gotten to build that muscle really well over the last couple of months. So that's like the first one I call it. Yeah.
I see. And how do you think, because you talked a little bit about, you've built, you said you built Pinpoint, you said in 3 months. You ideated on it for 3 months, then you built it in 10 weeks or something like that. How do you think it'll change your testing process, given that you just shared that piece of information? Were you testing with the right end size population? Yeah. Who were the people that you primarily did your testing with? Were they LinkedIn users? Were they other gamers?
Yeah. Look, so I think a couple things. One is when we test with a very broad audience. So that means across geos, across languages for us as well, especially with Queens and Tango. When you think about LinkedIn as a global product with a global member base, that's something that's super important for us. Going across languages, which means like getting the translations exactly right, especially for a logic game. If the translation's a little off and like something reads incorrectly, then you just don't understand the rules of the game. So we always test across our entire member base before we launch. The way that we test is we have smaller testing groups, so it's not something where when we release, we're releasing to a small percent of members. When we release, we actually release to all members, and it's unusual at a company like LinkedIn to do that. But the reason we do that goes back to the whole reason we have games, which is to drive connection and conversation. So what's important for us is if you played one of our games and you send it to a friend or a colleague or family member, that person has to be able to play. Like that is a principle that we just have. We should never be in a spot where someone plays a game and they share it with someone and that person cannot play. Going back to the reason we have games is to drive conversation. So when we launch, we are live. Like everyone is seeing it. So all of our testing is done prior to launch. And, based off it took us a week or two from the initial launch to calibrate like perfectly to like that 60%. And because we built that muscle, it was way faster for Tango. Right. It took us like 2-3 days. Boom. We know what we need to do. In fact, with Tango, we had a supply of varying levels of difficulty of grids ready to go so that we actually often make swaps. Like later today, we might decide that tomorrow's game is going to be a little different than what we had planned a couple hours ago. So we have a backlog of puzzles that we've lined up. And based off that initial data, we're like, great, now we need to go towards this end of the backlog and pull all of those puzzles up and throw all of these out, which is totally fine. Because ultimately, we're generating a lot of puzzles with the goal of having the one perfect puzzle for each day. So that's where some of those learnings came in and made Tango like a lot faster.
All right. Okay. So that was a lot about the games of LinkedIn. And now let's talk a little bit about our final topic, which is the engagement and business, I guess, of LinkedIn games. And we talked about the business a little bit strewn throughout, right? Which is basically summarily the tide that lifts all boats. We want people to be more engaged on the platform and find more connections. There is currently no advertising, no specific subscription model tied to the games themselves. But you guys have 1 billion users, and you just told me that Queens is, quote, taking off. How many of your 1 billion users are actually engaging with games on the platform?
Yeah. Okay. So unfortunately, not yet sharing any stats in terms of the number of people who are playing. I think at some point we might start doing that. So a little too early. The couple stats that we have been sharing that I'll share in terms of engagement is the first one is how people hear about the games. 40% of people, right, who are hearing about the games, we know for sure that is directly from a message from someone. And there's a lot of people who we can't track, right, who are just hearing about it from friends, like through channels that we're not able to necessarily see. But one thing that we know is that overall, when you look across all these things, the games are driving conversation. They are driving community. That's how people like go into them and find them. The second thing that we know is that when someone comes to play one of the games, they are coming back to play the games and they're coming back to converse about the game. So 80% of people who are playing any one of the games today will be coming back tomorrow to play that game, which is extremely high from like a retention perspective.
That's huge, actually.
80% of people who play are coming back the next day to play. And when you think about like, whoa, like that feels a lot higher than what I would expect. It goes back to the strategy of community and conversation, right? Because when your friend, when your colleague is messaging you tomorrow morning what their Queen score, you want to reply with your queen score. You don't want to not be a part of the conversation, right? So then you come in, you play, and then you share your score back in that thread. So that's one thing that's been going really well is the focus on community, the focus on conversation actually makes the product more attentive. Because in a typical gaming, company in a game space, you'll sit down and you'll think about, I need to drive D1R, I need to drive D7R, I need to drive D30R. We think that's D28 because we have the weekend effect on LinkedIn. But you think about those metrics. And absolutely, like we track every one of those metrics. One of the things we're intentional about is while we are not a gaming company, we cannot be oblivious to the metrics that matter for games. So we're very aware of our D1, our D7, our D28, and what those look like, where they're trending, where they're going. But when you think about what to optimize, it goes back to the mission. We optimize for community, for conversation, for connection. And when we do that, D1, D7, D28, they all lift. So going back to what I was saying, 80% of people who play today will play tomorrow. 76% of people who play today, so today's Friday, will be playing next Friday. Like they'll be coming exactly on next Friday to play our games again. So it is a very highly retaining product. But again, the reason that retention is high is because we've focused on community and conversation and connection. And when your colleagues are doing something, when your friends are doing something, when your family is doing something, and it's a community that you care about, you want to do that too.
Yeah. I mean, an 80% D1 is incredible. High retention. And even if you just calc that over to D7, that's like a 20% D7, which is also fairly strong. But obviously that's 80. You said 80% D1 necessarily mean it's 80% attach rate per day. Because you have the cyclical nature of the engagement over the course of the week. But that is, fairly impressive. And I know that you're not publicly obviously sharing, how many specific people are engaging, but have you noticed maybe any trends about who is playing across geo, age, profession?
Fun ones here. The largest segment that is playing is Gen Z.
Fascinating.
Which, it's I love it. I think it's definitely fascinating. It's this is one of those products when people often ask hey, what were the conversations when you started? The conversations internally when you started building games. And I share with you basically what they were, which is it started with we need to find new and novel ways for people to connect with each other and spark conversations. Mm-hmm. It wasn't hey, Gen Z is a really important audience. How do we go after Gen Z? Let's build, that was not the conversation. But you build it for the reason of you want to just drive community and conversation for anyone, regardless of age, regardless of background, regardless of geo. And then you look at the data and it's whoa, this is really cool. Gen Z is becoming really popular. So then we actually started this thing called a study break contest a couple months ago, 2 months ago, when back to school started, where we had campus competitions. And Georgia Tech, for some reason, always crushing it in terms of students are playing, in terms of the average score, all that sort of stuff. But we see a lot of students, a lot of Gen Z playing. And this is a really a fun, interesting anecdote, right? Going back to the reason we built this is to drive community conversation, professional connection. Oftentimes what these folks are doing is when, we launch these games during intern season, pretty much, right? Because it launched right when school came out. The interns then bring the games to the company. And then other people in the company start playing. So it's this interesting effect that we see of folks, not to overuse the term influencers, but becoming influencers through the games. To drive more conversation at their company. So that's one. Another one that I'll call out is a lot of international outside of the US focus. So India is our fastest growing market for our games. We see a lot of engagement in Brazil and Turkey as well. So we see a lot of engagement outside the US. We see a lot of engagement outside English as well. So one of the things that's awesome about a game like Tango, a game like Queens, is that there is no English language context that you need. Pinpoint and cross climb, obviously, even if we wanted to translate them, you can't translate them, right? Because there's a lot of when you look at the clue, it's you can't just translate it and it'll work. It might not be 4 letters still after that. All those things start to play in. Whereas Queens, Tango, anyone, anywhere in the world, any language is able to play those games. So we see a lot of growth outside the US as well. And it's important for us. We're a global company, a global product with a very large global member base. So we think about members across.
Awesome. What about any differences between mobile and web engagement?
Yeah, as you'd expect, mostly mobile.
Mostly mobile.
Yeah, exactly. So about 65% mobile, 35% web. So mostly mobile. Yeah.
Interesting.
But the games are the exact same experience if you play on mobile or desktop. I will say, a kind of quick hot tip for folks. Cross climb, you will always be faster if you play on desktop, just because you have access to the desktop keyboard. It is much easier to click around. Queens, I think this is a little bit of a maybe contentious topic for some folks. I think it's easier to play on mobile because you can swipe the X's. So you have to swipe to place all the places where you can't place queens. On desktop, it just takes a little extra effort to hit and like drag and do that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's the same exact game, but some of these, like you realize, well, it's actually more easy or sometimes more fun to play on a specific platform.
Yeah, but it's like also like, from the regular gaming world, that input design, that UI, UX display, and all those types of things are strong considerations that you have to make for web versus PC products. Is there any kind of anomaly or behavior that you've observed that you didn't expect?
Okay, one funny one was when we launched, the number of people who needed to let like their colleagues know that they didn't use a hint. Like this became such a thing because in each of our games we have hints, and in some of them we actually even have reveals where if you just want the row, we'll give it to you. Just because it's important to us that while the game should be challenging, you should never feel truly stuck. Like a hint should all, and we can talk more about the hint too. Like there's a lot of work that when we go back to like the engineering team and what we focus on, there's a lot of work that goes into the hinters inside these games for this reason, and the engineering and the algorithms behind the hinters. But when we think about these games, it's super important for us. I'm like losing my train of thought now. What was the last thing that you mentioned? Sorry, we can.
What was the most interesting anomaly or behavior that you've noticed?
Okay. So the number of people who wanted to state that they were not using a hint. So like I mentioned, we have like hinters and reveals and all that sort of stuff inside the game. But people wanted to know that I didn't use that today. So what we saw people doing organically is after they like post their score on LinkedIn, they would add like, I was flawless. Like it just became a thing of like the community started saying they were flawless. And it's like, okay, like you're flawless. That's awesome. And like that's something that we realized was important for folks who like didn't use a hint to let their connections know that they didn't use a hint. So we actually built that into the product. So if you share your score today and you didn't use a hint, it'll actually say you were flawless. That isn't something where like we were sitting in a room being like, oh, let's add a flawless thing. We actually saw people organically doing that. So we're like, great, let's do it. And then like another one was the number of people I've heard from who actually have like leaderboards inside their company in like a Google Sheet or like a Slack like chat where they keep track of these sorts of things, of how like different functions, orgs, people, all this sort of stuff, how they're doing. That was like a cool, like one of the things we talk a lot about at LinkedIn is like this idea of duct tape, where it's always good to look for where your members are using duct tape to build something you haven't built. And members are sticking together duct tape to create like Google Sheets and like Slack threads for their game scores. And what we noticed was in these like, and people would post about on LinkedIn, so I'd message them to learn more about it. And oftentimes these conversations, they would get a little stuck actually, because you'd want to talk about like Tango or Queens or something like that. But then like all you had to go off of was the time, because that's all was in like the initial share text that we had was like, I solved it in 3 minutes and 12 seconds. And then it's just like, great. Like I solved in 3 minutes, 12 seconds. You solved in 2 minutes, 40 seconds, like fine. But you can't actually really talk much more beyond that. So that's the reason about like 2 or 3 months after, we added so much more context to the share text because members were organically doing this stuff in these chats, being like, well, I placed blue first. I got this color last. Like, how did you go about the grid? And then we took that and turned it into what you see like in the share object today. In Pinpoint, one thing that we did, which I think is super fun, is you'll see a little percent after each like after each guess that you made. And that's semantic similarity, where we're actually saying like, if your first guess was, so we'll use dog, you guessed dog, we'll say like it's like 8% close, right? And that actually makes it interesting because when you share your score with someone, we can't put the word dog there because that ruins it for that person, right? It's important that like the share text has enough interesting context, but not a spoiler. So we can't have a spoiler. So we'll still, we'll say the percent. And that turns into a conversation because it's like, what did you guess that was like only 1% close? Or what did you guess that was like 97% close, but wasn't the actual answer? Those turn into really interesting conversational topics. So those are things that we just notice like members organically doing like in their own ways through duct tape. It's like, well, we can just build this and like make it easier for everyone.
That's awesome. I think we have a word for that. It's called generating player stories, right? You want to have what we call like emergent gameplay where systems connect together. And then when those systems connect together, interesting things happen. And then when those interesting happens, something that is unique to you, and there's a story that you can tell there about how that happened to you. We are really running up on time, so I want to get to our two concluding questions.
Yeah, I got time, by the way, so we can.
The first is, what is the best? Sorry. The first is, what is the number one thing consumers are currently asking for that you are planned to build into the platform? You know, you actually talked about this duct tape thing. So is it a Google Sheet solve, or is it more games? What are you guys cooking up in the lab?
Yeah, lots of things cooking. The one that I'll call out that people consistently ask for that lines up with our mission, our priorities, is more ways to have conversations around the games. Like more ways to understand how my connections performed, how that compares to how I performed. At the same time, we need to be mindful and respectful and thoughtful that there's some people who don't necessarily want their score just shared with everyone, right? So it's important that when we think about building things that make it easier to start conversations, that it doesn't alienate anyone. So lots of things that we're thinking about, like how do we build these features in the right way so that it's easier for you to compare scores with your connections, your colleagues, and have it be like very trusted and respectful. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a fear that now that you mentioned this flawless thing, you might be breeding a new generation of professional gamers, and so you'll just have a bunch of GGEZs everywhere. Watch out!
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then the other final question is, in your mind, what's the best version of the LinkedIn gaming future? It's been 5 years from now. What does LinkedIn gaming look like to you?
So, number one, like when I think about like ultimate success, and when we think about like what even like our vision statement is, like if thinking oriented games become the world's most common professional conversation starter, we've done our jobs. Like that's it. That's how we measure success, right? It's not like a certain number of players. It's not a certain retention number. It's not a revenue number. If thinking-oriented games become the world's most common professional conversation starter, we've nailed it. In terms of what that looks like, I'm excited to learn and figure out, right? Like I've got thoughts now of what that could look like. I hope those thoughts change like 2 months and 3 months and 6 months from now, because there's so much that we learn from our members when we launch these games, when we see how folks engage. So, at a high level, I imagine it continuing to be thinking-oriented games that take only a few minutes, that spark really meaningful conversations and connections that make you more productive in your professional life.
That's awesome. I'm excited to see 5 years from now. How did you get your job at Amazon? Well, I played Queens with this principal engineer, and then I ended up working there.
Off. Yeah.
Perfect. So look, Laksh, this was so awesome. It's awesome to hear a lot about LinkedIn's strategy for games, what you've built so far, and where you're going. There's clearly a lot of opportunity here, and I'm excited to keep engaging myself personally with some of the games on the platform. It was so great to have you on. As always, friends, to our audience, if you have feedback or ideas, please hit me up at alexandra@naavik.co. I'm always open. And with that, that's our episode. Thanks, Laksh, for coming on.
Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.